The weeks that followed were strangely quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. After that first night when Ethan raised his voice and called me useless, I expected an apology the next morning. I thought maybe he'd come to the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck like he used to when he was nervous, and say, "Sorry, Dad, I was stressed." But morning came, and he barely looked at me. He left for work without a word, the door clicking shut like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished. Sarah tried to smooth things over, making extra coffee and asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. But her eyes carried a heaviness I'd never seen in her before. My daughter kept her earbuds in, pretending she didn't hear the tension. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my cup, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. A father shouldn't have to tiptoe in his own home, yet there I was, careful not to make a sound that might spark another eruption. Days turned into weeks, and the small kindnesses that once filled the house began to fade. Ethan stopped sharing details about his work. Sarah stopped inviting me to family dinners in the dining room. I found myself eating leftovers alone at the kitchen counter. My granddaughter stopped asking me to read bedtime stories. Each absence felt like a tiny rip in the fabric of my heart, and no matter how many times I told myself it was just a phase, the rips kept growing. I tried to keep busy. I fixed a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, even though nobody thanked me. I swept the porch when the autumn leaves started to fall. I told myself that if I kept contributing, if I stayed useful, maybe they'd see my worth. But every evening, when the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the living room floor, the house grew colder. Not physically, but emotionally. It was as if warmth had become a luxury I could no longer afford. One Sunday afternoon, I overheard Ethan talking on the phone. I wasn't eavesdropping, just passing by the hallway when his voice carried through the slightly open door. "I can't keep carrying him forever," he said, frustration dripping from every word. "He's not even trying to get back on his feet. He just sits there." My stomach tightened. He was talking about me, about his father, the man who once worked 2 jobs so he could go to college, the man who stayed up late helping him with science projects, the man who skipped vacations to pay for his wedding. I backed away before he could see me, but the words burned into my chest like a brand. Carrying him forever. Was that how he saw me now? A burden, a weight to be dragged through his life until he finally let go? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake on the couch in the small guest room they'd given me, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. My thoughts spun with it. I remembered the years when Ethan was small, when he'd fall asleep in the back seat of the car and I'd carry him inside, careful not to wake him. I remembered whispering promises to him while he slept, promises that I'd always be there to protect him no matter what. How ironic that the boy I once carried now saw me as something to carry himself. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. After that first night when Ethan raised his voice and called me useless, I expected an apology the next morning. I thought maybe he'd come to the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck like he used to when he was nervous, and say, "Sorry, Dad, I was stressed." But morning came, and he barely looked at me. He left for work without a word,
the door clicking shut like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished. Sarah tried to smooth things over, making extra coffee and asking if I needed anything from the grocery store, but her eyes carried a heaviness I'd never seen in her before. My daughter kept her earbuds in, pretending she didn't hear the tension. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my cup, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. A father shouldn't have to tiptoe in his own home, yet there I was, careful not to make a sound that might spark another eruption. Days turned into weeks, and the small kindnesses that once filled the house began to fade. Ethan stopped sharing details about his work. Sarah stopped inviting me to family dinners in the dining room. I found myself eating leftovers alone at the kitchen counter. My granddaughter stopped asking me to read bedtime stories. Each absence felt like a tiny rip in the fabric of my heart. And no matter how many times I told myself it was just a phase, the rips kept growing. I tried to keep busy. I fixed a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, even though nobody thanked me. I swept the porch when the autumn leaves started to fall. I told myself that if I kept contributing, if I stayed useful, maybe they'd see my worth. But every evening, when the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the living room floor, the house grew colder. Not physically, but emotionally. It was as if warmth had become a luxury I could no longer afford. One Sunday afternoon, I overheard Ethan talking on the phone. I wasn't eavesdropping, just passing by the hallway when his voice carried through the slightly open door. "I can't keep carrying him forever," he said, frustration dripping from every word. "He's not even trying to get back on his feet. He just sits there." My stomach tightened. He was talking about me, about his father, the man who once worked 2 jobs so he could go to college, the man who stayed up late helping him with science projects, the man who skipped vacations to pay for his wedding. I backed away before he could see me, but the words burned into my chest like a brand. Carrying him forever. Was that how he saw me now? A burden? A weight to be dragged through his life until he finally let go? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake on the couch in the small guest room they'd given me, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. My thoughts spun with it. I remembered the years when Ethan was small, when he'd fall asleep in the back seat of the car, and I'd carry him inside, careful not to wake him. I remembered whispering promises to him while he slept, promises that I'd always be there to protect him, no matter what. How ironic that the boy I once carried now saw me as something to carry himself. The next morning, I tried to talk to him. I caught him as he was pouring cereal into a bowl, his hair still damp from the shower. "Ethan," I began, keeping my voice steady, "I overheard you on the phone yesterday. I just want you to know I'm trying. I don't want to be a burden." He didn't meet my eyes. He set the cereal box down a little too hard. "It's fine, Dad," he said flatly. "I didn't mean anything by it." But I knew he did. His tone said everything his words didn't. The distance between us stretched wider. Sarah, sweet Sarah, tried to bridge the gap. Later that week, she invited me to help her cook dinner. We chopped vegetables side by side, the rhythmic sound of knives hitting the cutting board almost soothing. She told me about her students, about the new art project she was excited for. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days. We even laughed when I accidentally dropped a carrot slice on the floor. But when Ethan came home, the air changed. He barely acknowledged me, kissed Sarah on the cheek, and went straight upstairs. The laughter died in my throat. I began to wonder if I should leave. The thought terrified me, but staying felt like standing in a room slowly filling with water. Each day the water rose a little higher, and I was running out of air. But where would I go? My pension barely covered basic expenses, and the housing market in Chicago was unforgiving. I didn't have many friends left. Most had moved away or passed on. The few that remained were dealing with their own problems. I felt trapped, like a bird in a cage that kept shrinking. One evening, a small argument over the TV remote spiraled into something much bigger. I wanted to watch the evening news. Ethan wanted to watch a basketball game. It was nothing, a trivial thing. But he exploded. "Why do you always have to make everything about you?" he shouted. "You're living here rent-free, eating our food, and you can't even let me have the TV for one night?" Sarah tried to calm him, but the words were already out, sharp and cruel. My granddaughter stood in the hallway, her wide eyes reflecting the shock I felt. I handed Ethan the remote without a word and went to my room. Behind the closed door, I sank on the couch, my hands trembling, rent-free. As if the years I spent raising him, the sacrifices I made, could be reduced to a ledger of debts and credits. That night, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not just a few tears, but deep, shaking sobs that left me empty and raw. I thought of my late wife, the love of my life, and how grateful I was she wasn't here to witness this. She had always believed in the goodness of people, especially family. If she saw how our son treated me now, it would have broken her heart. The next morning, I tried to pack a small bag. Just the essentials, a few clothes, my old wallet, the photo of my wife and me from our wedding day. But when I reached the door, I froze. Leaving meant stepping into an uncertain world with no plan, no safety net. Staying meant enduring the slow erosion of my dignity. Both choices felt like defeat. Later that week, a small neighbor named Mrs. Hernandez knocked on the door. She's an older woman from down the street, always cheerful, always kind. She asked if I'd like to join her for a walk. I hesitated, but something in her gentle smile convinced me to go. As we strolled through the crisp Chicago air, I finally opened up. I told her about the tension, the words, the way Ethan looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. She listened without interrupting, her eyes soft with understanding. When I finished, she put a hand on my shoulder. "You are not useless," she said firmly. "You are a father. You raised a family. You built a life. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words warmed me in a way I hadn't felt in months. It was a small comfort, but it reminded me that not everyone saw me as a burden. Someone still saw my worth, even if my own son couldn't.
The nights grew colder as October deepened. Chicago's wind cut through the cracks of the old house, and even with a blanket draped over my shoulders, the chill settled deep in my bones. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for every sound. The creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sigh of the wind outside. I wondered if Ethan lay awake too, or if he slept soundly, untroubled by the rift widening between us. One Friday evening, Sarah knocked softly on my door. When I opened it, her face was pale, eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Dad, can we talk?" We sat on the edge of the bed, the small lamp casting a faint glow around us. She took my hand and squeezed it tight. "I don't know what's happening to Ethan. He's been so angry lately. I try to reason with him, but it's like he's someone else." Her words should have comforted me, but instead they deepened the ache. I wasn't imagining things. Ethan had changed. Sarah admitted she felt powerless too, trapped between the man she loved and the father she respected. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of our shared helplessness pressing down like a heavy blanket. When she finally left the room, I stayed seated, staring at the door she closed behind her, wondering when love had turned into a battlefield. The next morning, I overheard another conversation, this time between Ethan and Sarah. Their voices carried from the kitchen while I lingered in the hallway. "He can't stay forever," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "He's your father," Sarah replied. "Where would he even go?" "I don't know, but this isn't working. I didn't sign up to be a caretaker." The word caretaker sliced through me like a blade. I wasn't an invalid. I wasn't asking for someone to feed or bathe me. I just needed a roof over my head while I tried to rebuild my life. Was that too much for a son to give his father? That afternoon, I walked along the edge of Lake Michigan, the city skyline glittering across the water. I watched gulls dive for scraps and families laugh as they fed them. For a brief moment, I felt invisible, not in a lonely way, but in a freeing way. The wind tugged at my coat, and I wondered if the lake would keep my secrets if I shouted them into the waves. I wanted to scream my hurt into the open sky, to ask the universe why love could sour so quickly. Returning home, I found Ethan waiting in the living room. He didn't waste time. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, arms crossed. My stomach tightened. He explained, calmly at first, that the arrangement wasn't sustainable. He talked about expenses, about privacy, about next steps. But beneath the measured words, I heard what he really meant. "You don't belong here anymore." "I'm not throwing you out," he insisted, though his eyes told another story. "I just think it's time you found your own place." I wanted to argue, to remind him of the years I spent working overtime so he could go to college, the nights I stayed up caring for him when he was sick, the sacrifices I made so he could have a better life. But the words caught in my throat. I simply nodded, afraid that if I opened my mouth, the pain would spill out in a flood I couldn't control. After he left the room, I sat alone, staring at the family photographs lining the mantel. There was Ethan at 5, holding a toy airplane. Ethan at 18, grinning in his graduation gown. Ethan and Sarah on their wedding day, faces radiant with love. My own smile in those pictures looked so proud, so full of hope. I wondered if that version of me would even recognize the man sitting here now. That night, Sarah brought me a cup of tea. "I don't agree with him," she said softly, "but I can't stop him either." I thanked her, though the words felt hollow. I could see the guilt weighing on her, but she was caught in the same web I was, bound by love and duty, helpless to change Ethan's heart. Days passed as I searched online for affordable apartments. Each listing seemed more impossible than the last. Rent prices soared beyond my pension, and the waiting lists for senior housing stretched months, sometimes years. I began to realize that Ethan's next steps were less a suggestion and more an ultimatum with no real solution. Every click of the mouse felt like another reminder of my shrinking world. One evening, a letter arrived from an old friend, Robert, whom I hadn't seen in years. He'd moved to Milwaukee after his wife passed.
His handwriting wobbled across the page, but his words carried warmth. He wrote, "I heard through the grapevine that life's been tough. If you ever need a place to land, my door is always open." I held the letter to my chest, torn between relief and sorrow. Relief that someone still cared. Sorrow that the invitation came from a friend hundreds of miles away, not from the son whose house I was already in. As the first snow of the season dusted the city, Ethan's impatience hardened into open hostility. Little things set him off. A dish left in the sink, a jacket hung on the wrong hook. One night, he accused me of mooching when I asked if we could share a pizza. His voice rose, sharp and cold. My granddaughter peeked around the corner, her small face tight with confusion. I wanted to shield her from the ugliness, but I couldn't even shield myself. That night I dreamed of my late wife. She stood in a field of tall grass, smiling gently. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered. When I woke, tears streaked my cheeks. I clung to her voice as if it were a lifeline thrown across a stormy sea. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay. Not like this. I began quietly gathering my belongings. My few clothes, the wedding photo, Robert's letter. Each item I packed felt like a chapter closing, a piece of my life reduced to a small, worn bag. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. The hallway smelled faintly of Sarah's lavender candles. My granddaughter's drawing still decorated the fridge. Memories clung to every corner. Christmas mornings, late-night movies, the day Ethan brought Sarah home to meet us for the first time. I touched the doorframe of the kitchen, remembering how many times I'd walked through it with love in my heart. Ethan wasn't home when I left. Sarah stood by the doorway, tears brimming. "Please stay in touch," she whispered. I hugged her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake. "Take care of him," I said, though the words felt bitter. "I'll try," she replied. I stepped into the biting Chicago wind, the sky a dull gray. My breath rose in white clouds as I walked to the bus stop. Each step felt both heavy and liberating. Heavy with the weight of betrayal, liberating because I was finally reclaiming my dignity. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. I climbed aboard, clutching my bag, and found a seat by the window. As the bus slurred past, I thought of Ethan. I wondered if he would ever look back on this day and realize what he had done. Would he remember the father who carried him on his shoulders at baseball games? Who taught him to ride a bike? Who sat through endless school plays just to see him smile? Or would he only remember the man he called a burden, the man he pushed away? The bus turned onto Lakeshore Drive, and the city skyline faded into the distance. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, feeling a strange mix of grief and quiet resolve. My life as I knew it had ended, but a different life, a freer, though lonelier one, waited ahead. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a friend's door stood open. Somewhere beyond the pain, a new beginning might still exist. As the bus rumbled north, I whispered to the memory of my wife, "I'm still here. I'm still me." The wind outside howled, but inside, for the first time in months, I felt the faint stirrings of peace.
The Milwaukee bus station smelled faintly of coffee and wet pavement when I arrived just after midnight. The cold was sharper here, a knife-edge wind that sliced through my coat as I stepped onto the platform. I clutched my bag, the weight of my few belongings grounding me as I scanned the crowd for a familiar face. Then I saw him, Robert, my old friend from the factory days, standing near the entrance with a wide grin and a plaid scarf wrapped around his neck. "James," he called, striding forward. His arms opened wide, and for the first time in months I felt the comfort of a genuine embrace. "You look thinner," he said, pulling back to study me. "But you're here. That's what matters." His words loosened something inside me. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself, bracing against every disappointment. I exhaled, and for a moment the icy air didn't feel quite so cruel. Robert's home was modest but warm, a two-story house on a quiet street lined with bare winter trees. The smell of cinnamon greeted me as we stepped inside. His late wife had loved baking, and he still kept her recipes alive. He led me to a small guest room, freshly made with clean sheets and a stack of blankets. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's yours as long as you need it." That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence was different here, soft, welcoming. No tense footsteps outside my door, no muffled arguments in the kitchen. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe without fear of who might be listening. The next morning, Robert made pancakes and strong coffee. Over breakfast, he asked about Chicago. I hesitated, but something about his steady presence made it easy to talk. I told him everything. The sharp words, the cold silences, the final conversation that sent me packing. He listened without interruption, his eyes kind and sorrowful. "Kids forget," he said finally, stirring his coffee. "They forget we're human. They think we're unshakable, like we'll always be there no matter what. Sometimes it takes losing us to remember what they had." His words sank deep, both comforting and painful. I wondered if Ethan would ever remember. Would he wake one morning, see my empty chair at the kitchen table, and feel the weight of what he'd driven away? Or would he simply move on, relieved to have his house back to himself? The days in Milwaukee passed quietly. I helped Robert with small repairs around the house, tightening loose cabinet hinges, replacing a flickering light bulb. He refused to let me pay rent, but I insisted on buying groceries. Each task, each small act of usefulness chipped away at the numbness that had settled over me. I began to feel like a person again, not just a shadow lingering in someone else's home. Still, nights were the hardest. I missed my granddaughter's laughter, the sound of her tiny feet racing across the hallway. I missed the way Sarah always hummed while cooking, a soft melody that used to fill the house with warmth. I even missed the creak of the old Chicago stairs, sounds that once annoyed me but now felt like pieces of a life I wasn't ready to let go of. One evening, as I sat by the living room window watching snowflakes drift under the streetlight, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Sarah. My heart leaped and ached all at once. "Dad?" she called, trembling through the line. "Are you safe?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm in Milwaukee with Robert." A pause. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I tried to stop him. I begged him to reconsider, but she broke. He's too stubborn." Tears pricked my eyes. "It's not your fault, Sarah. None of this is on you." She told me my granddaughter missed me. She asked if they could visit someday. I said yes, of course, but deep down I knew the logistics, and Ethan's pride would make it difficult. Before hanging up, she added softly, "I love you, Dad. Don't forget that." After the call, I sat for a long time in silence, the phone warm in my palm. Sarah's words were a lifeline in the cold night. I clung to them, repeating them silently until the ache in my chest eased. Robert encouraged me to join a community center nearby. "You need people, James, not just me and these creaky walls." Reluctantly, I agreed. The community center was a bright, bustling place filled with retirees, young volunteers, and the comforting smell of fresh coffee. I signed up for a woodworking class, something I hadn't done since high school shop class. My first project, a simple birdhouse, turned out crooked, but the satisfaction of shaping something with my hands was indescribable. It was there that I met Mary Ann, a retired school teacher with silver hair and a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. She had a laugh that cut through the winter gloom like sunlight through clouds. We struck up a friendship, sharing stories over cups of tea after class. She spoke of her own grown children, some loving, some distant. She said, "Families are complicated, but so are we, and sometimes the family we find later is the one we were meant to have all along." Her words stayed with me. Maybe I couldn't change Ethan's heart. Maybe forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to come from me first. As weeks turned into months, I began to carve a life of quiet dignity. I volunteered at the center, helped shovel snow for elderly neighbors, and spent evenings reading in Robert's cozy living room. Milwaukee's winter was harsh, but inside I felt a warmth that Chicago had long since stolen. Then, one gray March morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unmistakable, Ethan's. My hands trembled as I tore it open. "Dad," it began, "I don't know where to start. Sarah gave your address. I've been thinking about everything, about how I acted, about the things I said. I was wrong. I let stress and pride get in the way of what really matters. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say I'm sorry." I read the letter 3 times, each word etching itself into my heart. An apology. A bridge, however fragile, extended across the distance between us. That night, I sat at Robert's kitchen table, the letter spread before me like a map to a place I wasn't sure I could return to. Part of me wanted to rush back, to hold my son and tell him I forgave him. Another part, the part still raw from months of hurt, whispered caution. Forgiveness is not a door you fling open. It's a slow turn of the handle, a cautious step inside. Robert poured me a cup of tea and said quietly, "Take your time. Healing isn't a race." I nodded, staring at the steam curling from the cup. For the first time since leaving Chicago, hope flickered, a small, tentative flame, but a flame nonetheless.
The morning after Ethan's letter arrived, I woke before sunrise. Robert was still asleep, and the house was wrapped in the soft hush of early dawn. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Outside, the first light spilled across the snow, turning it to silver. It should have been beautiful, but my chest felt heavy, as if the paper itself carried the weight of every choice I had yet to make. I traced the pen across the page without writing, thinking of all the words I could say. I could write about the nights I lay awake in that Chicago guest room, wondering when my own son had stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a burden. I could write about the way Sarah's voice cracked on the phone, her love stretched thin between loyalty to her husband and her care for me. I could write about the small humiliations, the arguments over the TV remote, the sting of the word mooching, the cold silence that followed me from room to room.
But in the quiet of Robert's kitchen, I realized that no letter could hold the full truth of those months. Words could never capture the loneliness of watching your child pull away, nor the strange mixture of grief and relief when you finally walk out the door. Instead, I set the pen down and let the silence speak. Later that morning, Robert found me still at the table. "You're up early," he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. I nodded toward the folded letter beside my coffee mug. "He wants forgiveness." "And what do you want?" Robert asked gently. The question lingered in the air. What did I want? To turn back time, to erase the cruel words, to walk back into my son's house as if nothing had happened? None of those were possible. What I wanted, what I truly longed for, was something quieter, a chance to feel like a father again, not a burden. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to run back. Part of me wants to stay far away." Robert poured himself coffee and sat across from me. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't even mean going back. Sometimes it just means setting yourself free." His words settled over me like falling snow, soft, steady, undeniable. Over the next few days, I carried Ethan's letter with me everywhere. I read it on park benches, in the woodworking class, even while standing in line at the grocery store. Each time the same sentence caught my eye: "I don't expect you to forgive me." It was the one line that sounded honest, unpolished. For all his pride, Ethan knew the depth of his own failure. One evening, as Robert and I sat by the fireplace, he handed me a small envelope. He said, "This is from Marianne," with a knowing smile. Inside was a simple note written in her elegant handwriting. "Family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who share your burdens." I held the note against my chest. Family, burdens, those words had defined my life for months, and now here I was in a city where no one shared my blood, but where I was treated with kindness and dignity. It struck me that perhaps family was not about obligation, but about choice. A week later, I finally sat down to write back to Ethan. "Ethan, I received your letter. I've read it many times. I can hear the weight in your words, and I believe you when you say you're sorry. The months I spent in your house were some of the hardest of my life. I felt unwanted, invisible, and hurt in ways I struggled to put into words. But you are my son. I loved you before you were born, and I will love you long after both of us are gone. I can forgive, but forgiveness does not mean returning to the way things were. I need time. Maybe one day we can sit together and talk as father and son again. Until then, I want you to know that I am safe, I am cared for, and I am finding my way. Take care of Sarah and your little girl. Tell her Grandpa loves her. Dad." I sealed the envelope and stared at it for a long time before sliding it into the mailbox. As the slot closed with a soft metallic click, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. I hadn't promised a reunion, but I had offered a bridge. Whether Ethan chose to cross it was now up to him. The following weeks passed with a quiet steadiness. My woodworking skills improved. The birdhouses I built began to stand straighter, their edges clean and proud. Marianne and I started sharing long walks around the frozen lake, our conversations easy and full of small laughter. Robert teased me that I was becoming a Milwaukee man, and maybe he was right. For the first time in a long while, I felt more like myself, not the wounded father, not the unwanted guest, but simply James. Then one bright Sunday morning, Sarah called again. Her voice carried a hopeful tremor. "Dad, Ethan wants to see you. He's been different, softer. He talks about you every day." I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me. A part of me swelled with cautious hope, but another part whispered caution. I wasn't ready to walk back into that house. Not yet. I said, "Tell him I'm glad he reached out. Tell him I love him, but tell him I need more time." Sarah understood. "Whenever you're ready, Dad, we'll be here." After the call, I stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant winter blue. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the bus ride through darkness, the cold nights in Chicago, the crushing silence of betrayal. I thought about the warmth of Robert's welcome, the laughter with Marianne, the quiet dignity I'd rediscovered in this new life. I realized something I wish I'd known months earlier. Sometimes love means staying, but sometimes love means leaving. Sometimes love is not about holding on, but about letting go of anger, of expectations, of the need to be needed. Standing there under the wide Milwaukee sky, I whispered a silent prayer for Ethan. I prayed he would learn the lessons I had learned the hard way, that pride is a fragile shield, that family is a gift never to be taken for granted, and that forgiveness, real forgiveness, requires humility from both sides. That night, as the city lights glittered beyond Robert's living room window, I sat with Marianne and Robert, sipping tea and sharing quiet conversation. I thought of my late wife, of the life we'd built, and of the son who still had a chance to find his way back to me. A deep, peaceful warmth filled my chest. I was no longer waiting for an apology, nor was I waiting for permission to live. I was already living. Before you go, please take a second to hit that subscribe button so you never miss heartfelt stories like this. And tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching, and what time is it right now where you are? Your words remind me that no matter the distance, we are all connected.